Well, I told you that we want to focus on the maritime industry and how Kenya can tap into the vast resources to accelerate economic growth. Eric Sirari is the programs manager at Trademark East Africa. He's now joining us here. And East Africa Trademark and Trademark East Africa has been very instrumental in helping African countries, especially on the eastern seaboard of the continent, to tap their maritime resources. Sirari, thank you so very much indeed for finding time to be with us here this evening. First of all, I want to find out, I mean, when you look at those figures, definitely they're depressing. You know, when you have a situation whereby you have a shoreline of about 300,000 kilometers, and when you look at the trade, intra-Africa trade is about 11%. This definitely makes a depressing face, right?
Yeah, it's quite depressing because Africa is very rich in resources. We know quite a bit of the resources in Africa as mostly end up in other destinations other than African countries. And the opportunity that is there for Africans and for Africa is quite great. However, most of the African countries over a very long time have remained as net importers. Yeah. And this doesn't give us quite a good position to compete with others who most of their economies are export oriented. Yeah, but then we've also had quite a bit of constraints between countries in Africa. And I think the Confederation Agreement is quite timely for Africa to be able to open up the opportunities in trade. Movement of people, movement of goods. I think the future looks a little bit more bright than it's been before. Yeah.
Let's, for example, pick the case of Kenya, whereby it has such a huge shoreline of about 500 kilometers. It shares the waters of the second largest lake in the world, and I'm talking about Lake Victoria. It hosts the largest desert lake in the world, and I'm talking about Lake Turkana. Without actually going into the rivers, the numerous rivers that we have as a country, but yet we are importing fish from China.
Yeah, it's quite sad. And the other interesting thing I was hearing the other day is people who actually live around the lake and the areas of Kisumu are actually eating fish from China. That's quite sad. But then, how is the trade structured in a way that it can be able to give these fishermen and the small traders the opportunity to adequately or fairly compete with the mass production from China? Yeah. So, do they have the adequate cold facilities to help them store their fish? Do they have the required structures? Do they have the right circles or societies to help them bring this fish to the market? And how is the market ready? And there's also quite a bit of knowledge in terms of, can they be able to compete with China if they would wish to push some of this fish out of the country? So there's quite a bit to be done there. But then I'm not sure whether restrictions will be the way to go when trading with China to be able to allow the fish coming to Kenya. But then it's more of how do we position the fishermen and the fish industry at large to be able to be competitive enough to fairly push out the fish that is coming in. Yet we have quite a bit of that within.
From where you see it, or from where you stand, do you think it is fair, for Kenya to place some sort of restrictions, on fish import in the country? I know the government tried this route, sometimes last year, but it failed to work because of obvious reasons.
Yeah, it is a very difficult question, I must say. But then the most interesting bit is what's really the government's intention in this. For sure, it's to protect the local fishermen and the industry at large. But then, do they have the volumes to be able to serve the market? do they have the facilities to be able to have this produce right, the fish to be able to reach out to the market right in time, in the right quality. So I think as government is struggling to be able to create that balance, I think also the private sector and people involved in the industry fairly need to step up their game to be able to match the competition. Yeah.
Tell me this, I mean, why is it that, you know, intra-African trade remains depressingly low? What are we not doing? Look at, for example, Europe. I mean, when you look at the European or the European intra-trade, it's almost 60%. Look at Africa, 11%. Where are we not getting it right?
I think restrictions over time have been one of the main reasons why this has not been possible. How easy is it for me to move goods from Kenya to, say, Mozambique or Zambia or Malawi as a Kenyan manufacturer or a Kenyan producer? How easy is it for me to move my labor from Nairobi to Maputo to be able to trade with the other countries in Africa? This has, over a long period of time, remained a challenge. And as you see, the EU, despite the challenges they have with Britain, they have remained very open to movement of labor, that is the workforce, and movement of goods. There's a time I took a road trip right from Amsterdam to into Frankfurt in Germany, and you will just cross the borders without seeing any officers and any form of restrictions. This then makes that market quite huge enough to be able to make the countries produce and consume internally in that framework. And I think there's opportunity for Africa as well. East Africa is making some steps through the EAC. We have the single customs territory, which is helping movement of goods within East Africa. As Trademark East Africa, we've been doing quite a lot of work. Recently, we have been helping the revenue authorities automate the information sharing between the countries as a measure to be able to help the countries trade together. So when you have produce coming from Rwanda going to Uganda, they should be able to be cleared and processed way faster than, say, goods that are coming from other regions from a preferential point of view, to be able to encourage trade within East Africa. Yeah.
And when we look at commitment, you know, by our political leaders, do you see some level of sincerity when they are talking about a borderless trade?
I think it's a very interesting question there, because borders also are political in nature. So as much as we would wish to trade, I think there's quite a lot to be done in terms of harmonizing our political viewpoints around these international borders. But then as Trademark, what we've been doing is to help in creating collaboration between these countries in a more systemic way, so that despite the international set borders and also the political systems between the countries, we are able to help the region trade between the countries. And when it comes to international politics, I think that's a very, very interesting area where only time can tell, because today we have a set of leaders who have a different vision, and tomorrow we have a different set of leaders who have a different vision. But I think what we need to do as East Africans, for instance, is to strengthen our institutions to that level whereby we can be able to foster our intentions despite who is in power. Yeah.
Well, let's take, for example, the case of Kenya, you know, with a coastline that spans about 500 kilometers and about 210 going inside Lake Indian Ocean. Yet, we do not even own a single ship.
Yeah, it's quite...
And look at, for example, a country like Ethiopia here, who are our neighbors here, a landlocked country, but yet they have about 11 vessels. Are we serious?
I think it's more of where has the government been able to prioritize its interests. I think Kenya has made attempts before around owning and operating ships, but then it is a very, very, very competitive market. I'm aware of Musk trying to diversify the business and also the other competitors in that sector for the reason of trying to see how do they sustain their businesses. I'm not very much convinced how ready we are in terms of fostering that area, because it's quite competitive. We have China, we have Russia, and many other international
I mean, you know, when you're talking about, you know, the industry being competitive, definitely it is.
Yeah.
And we know for sure that the world is very competitive as we stand here now. But look, for example, you know, the total bill that Kenya pays, you know, on shipping goods into this country is about almost 310 billion shillings, you know, every year. And we know for sure that the government is a major importer in this country. What if we were to wake up one day, you know, and come up with a policy that 70% of all public goods, you know, to be shipped through, let's say, Kenya National Shipping, National Shipping Line? Don't you think that would be a major part on the back of KNLC?
I think there are opportunities. For as long as it's looked at also from a global perspective, because of the partnering requirements in the other destinations like Dubai and many other interesting transit hubs, whereby for the business to remain viable, they have to be, there's need for arrangements to be able to make movements of goods, whether you're pushing in imports into the region or you're pushing out specific exports from the region. Then there should be enough trade to be able to sustain some of these initiatives.
But we already have that in place with the Mediterranean shipping line.
I think...
do you see like lack of goodwill or maybe hidden interest from the people who are supposed to be championing this agenda?
I think it's more of, in my viewpoint, and what I think is the reality is that that's an area that probably government has thought not to invest very much. And of course, government knows better why. But then...
but from where you sit or stand, why do you think is the reason?
I think it's more of issues of capacity. Do they have an adequate funds to be able to establish and sustain such a business? Do we have a willing private sector to support the government in that frontier? Would competition be something that we should be aware of while we're getting into this? So I think it's something that we need to think into more before we get into. And I'm sure previous attempts, the government has very good reasons why it's not been as successful as you would wish it to be.
Currently there's a bill in Parliament, you know, to amend the Merchant Shipping Act of 2009 to allow shipping lines to operate terminals here in Kenya. And we know that there is a protracted battle between some lawmakers and the Kenya National Shipping Line. Do you think this will by any means aid in this conversation?
It could if, say for instance, we had a very competitive port in terms of when you look at ports like Jebel Ali in Dubai or other ports in China, where you have the operation levels at some point and you also have quite a bit of volume. So maybe the injection of private sector might just be one of the interesting bits into the operations of the port that will be able to excite moving our current port to the next level. But then I think government has weighed its options, and I'm sure the attempts to be able to, say for instance, have a private section of the port operated by a private player, maybe that time is still coming, because there's the talks around the free port areas in Mombasa, and also the new or say probably the most recent container terminal, and I know there's more works on the third terminal now. So there are still opportunity for the private sector to come in and also create the competition to be able to spark growth in that area. Yeah.
And I don't know whether this is a slow implementation of government policies, but we know there has been strong desire, from the government end to set up free trade ports, to set up special economic zones, and we know that there has been a very strong attempt, to set up a special economic zone around the Dongo Kundu area, but delays in setting up these, is a bit frustrating even to investors. Do you think the government is serious and it's ready to walk the talk?
I think if you've been to that area, you'll see there's been quite a bit of injection of infrastructure, especially to be able to link that area.
It's only the Dongo Kundu bypass.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair start if we would want to.
But we've been talking about this for more than 15 years now.
You, of course, would know that there are politics around that area, and how and who will be able to run that port, and how will it be structured, how will the locals benefit. Should we get a private operator to come and establish and do all that and run it? And when you get to that conversation, it becomes very, very difficult, the way we structured the government
here. So the challenge is getting our politics right.
Yes.
How then do we do this?
I think honesty is very important, and
on the side of who?
The politicians especially. And I know the technocrats are very keen to steer that area, and they are very willing to support. For instance, if you have interested parties like Trademark East Africa who are very keen to spark growth in specific hubs, we have interests in helping in growing hubs around the coastal areas, around the lake region and many other areas. So there are opportunities for partnering where there is clarity in terms of where does the government want to go and where is the political goodwill to support such initiatives, because they are quite long-term investments, and any form of politics interference in such investments, I think, will make any investor shy away. Yeah.
So then the question comes, I mean, how do we, align our politics with our economic policies?
And as I'd mentioned earlier, I think continuously improving the structures in government to be able to make decision-making more structured, more sustainable, having the right people in power will be very important to...
And who are the right people, by the way? Come to think of it.
I think that's really for Kenyans to decide who they would wish to have as their right leaders. But then I think government is still doing quite a bit in ensuring that, say, the Ministry of Planning has set specific goals for a period. But then as Trademark, we continuously get to help these countries in East Africa and the larger Horn of Africa to be able to inject, if it is expertise, support, and many other ways to be able to help government align their initiatives to their bigger visions, like the Vision 2030 for Kenya, for instance. Yeah.
Because we have to end this discussion because of time, obviously. Tell me this, I mean, there has been a lot of, discussions, about reviving lake transport around Lake Victoria. And there has been a lot of talks about this. But when you look at the work on the ground, it's absolutely non-existent, if any.
Yeah, it's sad to see that happening. And as I'd mentioned earlier, what we're doing as Trademark is we are trying to see what can we do around the lake region as a hub, because we are interested to ensure that we establish hubs where there's quite a bit of things going. And we've seen that intermodal transport is one of the very important things that could spur and could inject new energy into that area. We hope that maybe SGR will be able to hit Lake Victoria, and that would make the inland countries that are landlocked be able to utilize Lake Victoria to get into goods into their countries. Yeah.
Sirari, we must come to the end of this program.
Thank you.
For now.
Yeah.
But this is an ongoing discussion, so let's hope that we'll be able to touch base in the future and, of course, take this discussion forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your insight tonight.
Yes, thank you, Kimani.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. We look forward to having this kind of engagement in the future. But at this point, we must come to the end of Business Insight for tonight. My name is O'Brien Kimani, and guess what is coming up next? Inside Government is finally here with us. It should be coming in the next 10 or so minutes. So you better get yourself ready tonight. As we said, we are talking to CS in charge of tourism and wildlife, Najib Balala. He is outlining and explaining to us some of the initiatives that the government is putting in place to rebrand brand Kenya as a viable tourism destination. My name is O'Brien Kimani. Enjoy watching Inside Government. From me and the rest of the Business Insight crew, enjoy the show.